In 1894, a single company in Philadelphia sold over 3 billion glasses of its drink. Not in a year, not across a decade, in a single calendar year. 313 million glasses, enough to give every man, woman, and child in the United States 5 glasses each. Walk into any American drugstore in the final decade of the 19th century, and you could not miss it. The amber bottles gleaming behind the soda fountain counter, the handsome ceramic mugs stacked in rows, the cheerful trade cards tacked to the walls, rosy-cheeked children clutching frothy glasses and beaming with impossible health. The smell, sweet, earthy, almost medicinal, like a forest floor distilled into a single sip. This was Hires Root Beer, America's original soft drink. Born in Philadelphia in 1876, it predated Coca-Cola by a full decade. At the height of its power, the Charles E. Hires Company operated factories on the Delaware River, held offices in Australia, Denmark, and England, ran a subsidiary in Canada, and owned a sugar plantation in Cuba. This was not a regional soda. This was a national institution. It shaped how Americans thought about soft drinks, about advertising, about health, about temperance. For generations, Hires Root Beer was not simply something you bought. It was something you believed in. Then, something began to go catastrophically wrong. Not overnight, not in a single dramatic collapse, but slowly, systematically, through a long series of decisions made by strangers who never understood what they had acquired. By the early 2000s, Hires Root Beer had vanished from American store shelves. By 2023, even the company that owned its trademark stopped listing it on their website. A brand that had survived the Civil War era, Prohibition, 2 world wars, and the FDA, was erased quietly. Not by scandal, not by failure, but by indifference. So how does the drink that invented American soda culture end up orphaned and forgotten? How do you kill something that lasted nearly 150 years? This is the story of a New Jersey farm boy who built an empire from roots and berries. Of a brand that fed a nation's thirst through drought and prohibition alike. And of the corporate carousel that passed America's original soft drink from one indifferent owner to the next, until nothing was left but a trademark no one bothered to defend. Welcome to the story of Hires Root Beer, where the greatest health-giving beverage in the world became the greatest forgotten brand in American history. 1851, Salem County, New Jersey. Charles Elmer Hires was born on August 19, 1851, on a small farm in Salem County, New Jersey, the 6th of 10 children born to John Dare Hires and Mary Williams Hires. The family was not wealthy. Young Charles had very little formal schooling. But there was something in the boy, a restlessness, a hunger, that no classroom could have contained anyway. By age 6 or 7, Charles was already collecting old bottles from along the roadside, cleaning them, filling them with colored liquids he brewed himself from local plants and roots, and arranging them in a makeshift play drugstore he had constructed in one corner of the family barn. Even as a small child, he was not simply playing, he was rehearsing. At age 12, his parents apprenticed him to his 2 brothers-in-law, pharmacists who had married Charles's older sisters. He learned the trade quickly and with ferocious dedication. By the time he was old enough to strike out on his own, he had already developed his first commercially successful product, a blend of roots and barks he called Hires Dyspepsia Mixture, a remedy his advertisements claimed would cure stomach pain, constipation, and general malaise. It sold. He opened his own drugstore on Spruce Street in Philadelphia, just off Washington Square. Walking through the neighborhood one midday, he noticed a pile of Fuller's Earth, a rare mineral clay used to remove stains from wool and fabric. sitting in a pile outside a nearby excavation. He tested it, confirmed its value, bought it cheaply, packaged it as Hires' special cleaner, and sold it at a substantial profit. The proceeds helped him expand. In the summer of 1875, the 24-year-old Charles Hires married Clara Kate Smith and took her on a honeymoon to a farm near Morristown, New Jersey. There, the farm woman who ran the boarding house served them a cool, refreshing drink she called homemade root beer, a sparkling, slightly sweet blend of native roots, herbs, barks, and berries. Hires tasted it and felt something shift inside him. He spent the rest of the honeymoon persuading the woman to share her recipe. He returned to Philadelphia with a handwritten recipe. 2 university professors he recruited to help him refine and stabilize it, and a certainty that he had discovered something America needed. He spent a full year experimenting, adjusting, testing, perfecting. The problem was what to call it. He had been thinking of it as root tea, but a friend, the Reverend Russell Conwell, who would later found Temple University, had a sharp piece of advice. The hard-drinking miners of central Pennsylvania, Conwell told him, will never touch anything called tea. Call it beer. Give it a name with weight to it, a name men won't be embarrassed to order. Hires listened, and in the spring of 1876, he had his product, his name, and his moment. The Philadelphia Centennial Exposition was coming. The whole country would be watching. This was his chance. May 10th, 1876, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The United States Centennial Exposition opened that spring at Fairmount Park in Philadelphia, a colossal World's Fair celebrating 100 years of American independence and showcasing the nation's industrial genius to the world. More than 10 million people would walk through its gates before it closed that autumn. 49 nations exhibited. It was the largest gathering of human beings on American soil up to that point in history. And among the exhibitors, working a modest booth with a modest product, stood a 24-year-old Philadelphia pharmacist named Charles Hires. He had prepared powder packets, each priced at 25 cents, each yielding 5 gallons of root beer when mixed with water, sugar, and yeast at home. He had prepared live demonstrations, and crucially, he had prepared free samples, cold, fizzing glasses of his root beer, handed out to passers-by without charge. The response was immediate and electric. People stopped. People lingered. People drank their glass and came back to buy packets. The word spread through the fairgrounds like the drink itself, cold and refreshing, and unlike anything most people had tasted in carbonated form. Hires had assembled a blend of 16 wild roots and berries: birch bark, licorice, ginger, sarsaparilla, wintergreen, juniper berries, hops, and sassafras among them. And the result was something earthy, sweet, complex, and utterly distinctive. He marketed it as a solid concentrate of pure natural ingredients. He claimed it would purify the blood, bring rosy color to the cheeks, and serve as a wholesome alternative to alcohol at a time when the temperance movement was gathering enormous social force. Whether or not those health claims were true, they spoke to a genuine hunger in the American public, the desire for a drink that felt virtuous as well as pleasurable. By the time the exposition closed, Hires had not merely sold product. He had planted a name in 10 million minds. He returned to his drugstore at 602 Spruce Street and immediately began scaling up. He moved production to a dedicated facility at 117 to 119 Arch Street in Philadelphia, a building that would become the first real factory in the history of American commercial root beer. By 1884, he had developed a liquid extract version and began supplying soda fountains directly, even designing his own proprietary dispensing machine, which he called the Hires Automatic Muni Maker. In 1890, he abandoned the pharmacy business entirely and incorporated his enterprise as the Charles E. Hires Company, a new American institution had been born. What happened next would make it unstoppable. Philadelphia, 1880 through 1895. Charles Hires understood something about commerce that most of his contemporaries did not. He understood that a great product, unknown, is no product at all. And so, years before mass advertising became standard practice in American business, Hires made a bet that would define how American consumer brands were built. He spent money on advertising the way other men spent money on factories. In 1893 alone, he poured $200,000 into advertising over the course of just 3 months, a staggering sum at a time when most businesses considered a single-column newspaper ad a bold expenditure. He personally lobbied the publisher of Philadelphia's largest newspaper, the Public Ledger, to accept multi-column display ads, a format that had never been used before in that paper. What he produced was revolutionary. Full-page advertisements in national publications, including the Ladies' Home Journal, at a time when Coca-Cola was barely known outside Atlanta, Georgia. Colorful Victorian trading cards distributed through drugstores and pharmacies, depicting rosy-cheeked children and wide-eyed pets, with health claims and ingredient lists printed on the reverse. Novelty items, pocket mirrors, pen knives, joke books, puzzle books, ceramic mugs, decorative lamps, all bearing the Hires name and logo. He produced a distinctive brand character in 1891 that advertising historians call the Hires Boy, a cheerful young mascot designed to make the brand feel warm and familiar. One advertisement from 1895 boasted a specific and staggering figure. In 1894, the company had sold 3,134,393 packages of Hires root beer, producing over 15 million gallons, or 313 million glasses, sufficient, the ad declared proudly, to give every man, woman, and child in the United States 5 glasses each. He was not just selling a beverage. He was building a mythology. He was telling a story about purity and health and the American character. The story of a self-made man from a New Jersey farm who turned the roots of the earth into the nation's drink. By 1900, the company was spending up to $500,000 annually on advertising. But here's the thing about mythology. It requires constant maintenance, and Hires was about to discover that not every story told about him would be one he had written. The counterfeiters arrived first. The Philadelphia Times reported in the 1890s that it was doubtful whether any modern commodity, excepting money itself, had been counterfeited more than Hires root beer. Courts eventually levied fines against imposters, but a far larger threat was already gathering on the horizon, one that wore the face of his most dedicated supporters. 1895, Philadelphia. Charles Hires had built his entire brand identity around temperance. He was a devout Quaker. He had named his product specifically to appeal to those who wanted an alternative to alcohol. He had marketed it relentlessly as the temperance drink of the highest medicinal value. And yet, in 1895, the most powerful temperance organization in America declared war on him. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, announced that Hires root beer contained alcohol. A freelance chemist had allegedly tested a bottle and found a high percentage of the substance. The WCTU called for a nationwide boycott. The New York Times ran a story headlined, in print, that shook boardrooms across Philadelphia. Is root beer insidious? The irony was almost grotesque. Hires, the man who had specifically chosen the word beer not to celebrate drinking, but to appeal to workers while selling them something wholesome and non-alcoholic, was now accused of secretly poisoning the temperance movement from within. The boycott was devastating. Sales dropped sharply for the better part of a year. His retailers grew nervous. His distributors wavered. The brand he had spent 2 decades building was being attacked by the very constituency it had been designed to serve. Hires fought back with the only weapon he truly trusted: advertising. He commissioned a full chemical analysis from a professor at the University of Pennsylvania who confirmed that Hires root beer contained only a trace of alcohol, less, in fact, than a loaf of bread. He published the results loudly, widely, and repeatedly. He had his root beer tested. He announced the laboratory's conclusion in full-page advertisements across the country. By 1896, the WCTU had quietly abandoned the boycott. They had no case. The professor's findings were unimpeachable. Hires had won. But the battle had revealed something important about the brand's vulnerability. It existed in a delicate cultural space, not quite a medicine, not quite a beer, not quite a soda. And that ambiguity could be weaponized by anyone with an agenda. Then came Prohibition, and everything changed again. Not against Hires this time, for him. When the 18th Amendment passed in January of 1920, banning the production and sale of alcoholic beverages across the United States, Hires root beer found itself in the most advantageous position it had ever occupied. An entire nation had just been told it could not have a beer, and Hires was already in the market with a product that said beer right there on the label. If you're finding this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into history, and we are only getting to the good parts now. This story is about to get dramatic. 1920 through 1933, America under Prohibition. The soda fountain had been growing as a cultural institution since the 1880s, but Prohibition transformed it into something more, into the center of American social life. With saloons shuttered and speakeasies illegal, men and women who had gathered at bars for generations now gathered at drugstore soda counters instead. They ordered sodas, ice cream floats, phosphates, and root beer. Lots and lots of root beer. Hires root beer was perfectly positioned. Its very name, with the word beer embedded right in the middle, carried a coded appeal to the millions of Americans who mourned their lost lager. The company understood this and leaned into it aggressively. Their advertisements during the Prohibition years carried the slogan, "The temperance drink that cheers but does not inebriate." Another campaign declared simply, "Hires root beer, the great health drink." The messaging was pitch perfect, virtuous enough to satisfy the temperance advocates, familiar enough to comfort the beer drinkers. A 1925 report from the United States Department of Commerce estimated that annual root beer production in the country had surpassed 100 million gallons. Soda fountains were everywhere, in every drugstore, every train station, every hotel lobby. The Hires automatic Muni Maker dispensed cold, carbonated root beer at soda counters from Maine to California. The company's international reach expanded, with offices in Australia, Denmark, and England, and a subsidiary operation in Canada. At its absolute peak, the Charles E. Hires Company owned a sugar plantation in Cuba to secure its raw material supply chain. Hires root beer had offices throughout the United States, a massive plant on the Delaware River at Delaware and Fairmount Avenues in Philadelphia, and production facilities in Malvern, Pennsylvania, and on North Broad Street in the city. The Hires name was not merely a brand, it was a national reference point. The company had also adapted brilliantly to changing consumer habits. By 1904, recognizing that home brewing was declining and soda fountains were ascendant, Hires had developed and distributed a professional-grade syrup version of the product specifically for fountain use. By the 1930s and 40s, thousands of soda fountains across the country sold millions of glasses of Hires root beer annually, mixed fresh from syrup at the counter, dispensed into those distinctive ceramic mugs. This was the golden age. This was the peak. Between 1900 and 1909, revenues at the Hires Company rose by an average of 29% annually. 65 million glasses of Hires were served in soda fountains at a nickel each in a single year. In 1925, Charles Elmer Hires, now in his 70s, handed control of the company to his sons. The family still believed. The dream was still intact. For now. 1925 through 1955, Philadelphia. Charles Elmer Hires lived to the age of 85, dying in 1937. By any measure, his was a life of extraordinary achievement. He had transformed a honeymoon recipe into one of the most recognized commercial brands in the history of American food and drink. He had pioneered mass advertising in a way that predated and in many ways shaped what Coca-Cola would later do with far greater resources. He had made root beer a national category, not merely a regional curiosity. And he had done all of this without formal education, without inherited capital, starting from a farm in Salem County, New Jersey, with nothing but a sharp eye and an unshakable belief in the power of advertising. His sons took the company forward through the 1930s and 40s. Then his grandson, Peter Wolf Hires, became president in 1955. The family name was still on the building. The family pride was still present. But the world outside that building had changed in ways that the founding mythology could not fully absorb. The golden age of the soda fountain was fading. Americans were buying cars and driving to the new suburban supermarkets, where they filled their shopping carts with prepackaged, branded goods. The intimate ritual of the fountain counter, the pharmacist who knew your name, the ceramic mug, the freshly drawn glass, was giving way to the aluminum can and the glass bottle and the refrigerator case. Root beer as a category faced a structural challenge. The great cola companies, Coca-Cola, consolidated into a national juggernaut by the 1930s, and Pepsi-Cola, reinventing itself through aggressive mid-century marketing, were capturing enormous market share, not just in cola flavors, but across the entire soft drink spectrum. Root beer, for all its cultural heritage, was a niche flavor. It did not travel as easily across demographic and cultural lines as cola did. It was quintessentially American, which meant it was quintessentially limited. And Hires, once the only game in town, now faced a crowded field. Barks had been founded in 1898 in Biloxi, Mississippi. A&W had launched in 1919 in Lodi, California, and had pioneered the frosted mug and the drive-in restaurant, an entirely new delivery format perfectly suited to the new automobile culture. Dad's Old Fashioned had entered the market in Chicago in 1937. Mug root beer had appeared in San Francisco in 1947. By the early 1950s, the Hires Company was struggling. Revenues remained relatively steady, but rising costs of materials and labor were grinding profits down. The family-run company, built on the personal charisma and relentless drive of its founder, did not have the institutional machinery to compete with what the industry was becoming. In 1955, Peter Wolf Hires sat at the president's desk. 5 years later, the desk would belong to someone else entirely. The founder's family was about to let go, and what happened next would set the brand on an irreversible course. 1960, Washington, D.C. In the same year that the Hires family sold their majority share in the company to Consolidated Foods Corporation, a Chicago-based food and consumer products conglomerate, the United States Food and Drug Administration delivered a ruling that struck at the very heart of what Hires root beer had always been. Sassafras oil was banned. The FDA's action was grounded in scientific evidence that had been accumulating through the 1950s. Studies conducted on laboratory animals demonstrated that safrole, the primary active compound in sassafras oil, was carcinogenic, capable of causing liver damage and cancer with sustained exposure. The FDA formally banned its use in commercially processed food and beverages, effective immediately. This was not a minor ingredient. Sassafras had been the foundational flavor note in Hires root beer since 1876. It was the earthy, spicy, distinctive element that made Hires taste like Hires and not like every other carbonated beverage on the market. It was the ingredient that root beer enthusiasts remembered, the quality that made the drink smell like medicine cabinet and forest floor and summer afternoon simultaneously. And it was now illegal. The timing was devastating in its symbolic weight. The year the Hires family sold their company was the same year the FDA gutted the drink's original soul. The company reformulated. Technicians in laboratories worked to replicate the flavor profile using synthetic alternatives. Vanillin for vanilla undertones, methyl salicylate for the wintergreen sharpness. The new version was close. Some consumers would not notice. But root beer enthusiasts, the people who had grown up on the real thing, noticed immediately. They described the reformulated version as more artificial, more medicinal in the wrong way, lacking the depth and complexity of the original. The reformulation was the first major change to the product's recipe in over 80 years, and it arrived in the same moment as the corporate transition that would begin stripping the brand of the family identity and institutional knowledge that had always protected it. Consolidated Foods, which had acquired Hires for practical business reasons, understood very little about what made root beer specifically different from other soft drink categories. They operated it as one division among many. 2 years later, in 1962, they sold the Hires brand again, this time to Crush International, which moved the company's headquarters from Philadelphia to Evanston, Illinois. The factory on the Delaware River fell quiet. Philadelphia, the city where Hires root beer had been born, where it had fed a nation and built a mythology, lost it forever. The soul of the brand had just left the building. 1962 through 1980, Evanston, Illinois, then Cincinnati, Ohio. Crush International was a company built on fruity, carbonated sodas: orange, grape, strawberry, lemon lime. Its entire corporate culture, its sales infrastructure, its marketing philosophy was oriented toward bright, sweet, fruit-forward flavors. Root beer was alien territory. Hires root beer, with its complex botanical heritage and its century-long identity as the original American soft drink, sat awkwardly inside a portfolio designed around tropical colors and summery sweetness. The brand continued to be produced and distributed under Crush, but without the ferocious advertising investment that Charles Hires himself had always believed was the oxygen of commercial success. The trading cards were gone. The ceramic mugs were fading from soda fountain culture as the fountains themselves disappeared. The novelty items and the promotional campaigns that had once embedded the Hires name into American households were reduced and then reduced again. Meanwhile, A&W was not just a root beer. It was a restaurant chain. By the 1960s and into the 70s, A&W restaurants and drive-ins were spreading across the American suburban landscape, serving their root beer in the frosted mugs that had become iconic, reaching millions of consumers through an in-person experience that bottled root beer could never replicate. A&W was investing in the category. Hires was managing it. In the mid-1960s, Crush International did launch one memorable advertising campaign for Hires. Jazz singer Blossom Dearie recorded a series of jingles in a distinctive Betty Boop voice, singing, "Hires root beer, Hires rootin' tootin' root beer, Hires rootin' tootin' rabble rousin', lion roarin', Roman candle lightin' root beer." The campaign had genuine charm and generated consumer affection. But charm without sustained investment is not a strategy. It is a memory. In 1980, Procter & Gamble, the Cincinnati-based consumer goods giant, acquired Crush International. Hires root beer was now part of a company whose core competencies were laundry detergent, soap, and shampoo. Procter & Gamble operated Hires as part of its soft drink holdings, but the brand was never a priority. It was a legacy asset in a portfolio that did not specialize in legacy assets. The soft drink industry by 1980 was a different animal from the one Charles Hires had shaped. Coca-Cola and Pepsi had locked up the vast majority of supermarket shelf space, restaurant fountain contracts, and television advertising budgets. Root beer as a category was surviving, but Hires was losing ground within that category to A&W, which benefited from its restaurant chain's enormous brand presence. The problem was structural, and it was about to get dramatically worse. 1989, London and Plano, Texas. In 1989, Procter & Gamble made a strategic decision to exit the soft drink business entirely. It divested its entire soft drink holdings. Hires root beer was sold to Cadbury Schweppes, a British confectionery and beverage company headquartered in London. This was the fourth owner in less than 30 years. The Charles E. Hires Company, built by one man over decades, was now being traded between corporations like a minor line item in a larger asset negotiation. Each new owner brought different priorities, different organizational cultures, different strategic frameworks. None of them had any particular attachment to root beer as a category or to Hires as a historical artifact. They had balance sheets to manage. Cadbury Schweppes was a more natural home for beverages than Procter & Gamble had been. The company owned Dr. Pepper, 7-Up, and a range of other carbonated soft drinks, giving Hires at least a corporate context in which it made sense. But Cadbury Schweppes also owned, or would come to own through further acquisitions, A&W root beer. And this created a structural problem that would ultimately prove fatal. Within the same corporate portfolio, Hires and A&W were now internal competitors. They were fighting for the same consumer, the same shelf space, the same fountain contracts, the same marketing budget. And A&W was winning. By the 1990s, A&W was far more widely distributed, far more heavily advertised, and far better supported by the infrastructure of the restaurant chain that bore its name. Hires had no equivalent anchor. It had no restaurant chain. It had no frosted mug moment. It had history, but history without investment does not generate quarterly revenue. By the mid-1990s, Hires root beer had been replaced in Canada entirely. Retailers and vending machines that had carried Hires for decades switched to Pepsi-owned mug root beer. The Canadian market, once a significant part of Hires' international footprint, supported by a long-standing subsidiary operation, was gone. In 2008, Cadbury Schweppes made the decision to spin off its North American beverage operations entirely, separating the soft drink business from the confectionery business. The resulting company renamed itself Dr. Pepper Snapple Group. Hires root beer transferred again, this time not through a sale, but through a corporate restructuring. Nobody signed a check specifically for Hires. It simply came along. The drink that had been born in a Philadelphia pharmacy in 1876 had now passed through 5 corporate owners in less than 50 years. And the worst was yet to come. We're halfway through this incredible story. If you're enjoying it, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support means everything, because the next part, the quiet erasure of a legend, is something every person who loved Hires root beer deserves to hear. 2008 through 2016, Plano, Texas. Dr. Pepper Snapple Group now controlled the root beer category in a peculiar way. It owned both Hires root beer and A&W root beer, the two oldest mass-market root beer brands in America. One of them, A&W, had a thriving restaurant chain partner that kept its name in front of millions of consumers every day. The other, Hires, had history, nothing else. The strategic choice was not difficult. It was not even a choice, really. It was a foregone conclusion that operated in slow motion. Dr. Pepper Snapple Group directed its marketing resources, its shelf space negotiations, its bottling contracts, and its fountain distribution toward A&W. Hires received increasingly limited support. The logic was coldly rational. Why invest in a brand that competes with your stronger brand in the same category? Why run 2 root beers when you can run 1? But here's the thing. The logic was also historically illiterate. Hires root beer was not just another root beer. It was the root beer, the brand that had created the commercial category in the first place, nearly a century before A&W existed. Its slow disappearance from American shelves was not merely a business decision. It was the erasure of a cultural artifact. Consumers who had grown up on Hires began noticing its absence. A bottle would disappear from a local supermarket's shelf in the mid-2000s and never return. A diner that had carried Hires syrup for 40 years would switch to A&W when the next fountain contract came up for renewal. Online forums dedicated to vintage sodas began filling up with morning posts. Where did Hires go? Where can I find it? Does anyone know if it still exists? In the early 2010s, the bottled and canned versions of Hires root beer were discontinued entirely. The production lines that had once bottled millions of units were shut down. A brand that had survived the FDA, Prohibition, 2 world wars, and the Great Depression could not survive the corporate strategy of its 5th owner. Hires syrup for soda fountain use persisted longer, produced by a small Arizona company called Khalil Bottling Company of Tucson. But even that was a ghost operation, maintaining the last physical form of a brand that had once commanded industrial production facilities in 3 Philadelphia locations and overseas. By 2016, Hires root beer was still technically listed on the Dr. Pepper Snapple Group website as a current product, but good luck finding it. Dedicated root beer hunters reported that it had become almost impossible to locate in ordinary retail settings. Online specialty retailers carried it in limited quantities. The reality and the official listing had diverged completely. The ghost was still being maintained, but the body had already gone cold. 2016 through 2024, Tucson, Arizona, and Ottumwa, Iowa. There is something haunting about the final years of a great brand. The institutional memory fades. The people who built it are gone. The people who love it are aging. And the people who own it have no particular interest in its history or its meaning, only in the modest revenue it still generates and the cost of maintaining even that diminished presence. For Hires root beer, those final years were lived out in the most stripped-down form imaginable. The American Bottling Company in Ottumwa, Iowa, canned the last regular production runs of Hires. Khalil Bottling Company in Tucson, Arizona, continued producing Hires root beer-flavored syrup for soda fountain use, serving the small number of old-fashioned diners, drugstore counters, and specialty establishments that still offered fountain root beer and specifically requested the Hires brand. In Canada, the story had already been written. By the 1990s, Keurig Dr. Pepper had stopped distributing Hires as a soft drink north of the border entirely. In a decision that felt darkly comic, the Canadian rights to the Hires name were eventually used for something else altogether. Canada Dry Mott's began marketing an alcoholic drink called Hires Root Beer and Vodka. The brand that Charles Hires had built as a temperance drink, as the great health drink, as the virtuous alternative to alcohol, was now being used to sell a cocktail premix. The irony would have made the man weep. In 2023, Keurig Dr. Pepper, the company formed by the merger of Dr. Pepper Snapple Group with Keurig Green Mountain in 2018, quietly removed Hires root beer from its official list of brands on the company website. No announcement, no farewell, no acknowledgement of the drink's 147 years of history. One day it was there, in the fine print of a corporate brand portfolio. The next day, it was not. The last institutional act came in August of 2024. Khalil Bottling Company of Tucson, the final producer of Hires root beer-flavored syrup for soda fountain use, sold its operations to Keurig Dr. Pepper. The last physical production of anything called Hires root beer passed entirely into the hands of the corporation that had no practical use for it. What Keurig Dr. Pepper will do with the Hires name, trademark, and formulation going forward remains unclear. The company has not announced a revival, a discontinuation notice, or any plans of any kind. The brand simply sits in a corporate vault, neither alive nor officially dead. It is, in every meaningful sense, an orphan. 1919 through the present. The ultimate measure of a pioneer's impact is not what they built, but what they made possible. And by that measure, Charles Elmer Hires was one of the most consequential figures in the entire history of American consumer culture. Every root beer brand that followed Hires, every A&W, every Barks, every Dad's, every mug, was built on the foundation that Hires had laid. A&W, founded in 1919 in Lodi, California, by Roy Allen and Frank Wright, explicitly modeled its product and marketing strategy on the commercial template that Hires had developed. Barks, founded in 1898 in Biloxi, Mississippi, by Edward and Gaston Bark, was so nervous about Hires' trademark power that it initially refused to use the words root beer in its name at all. Think about that. The second commercial root beer brand in American history was afraid to say what it was because Hires had so completely defined the category. The advertising innovations that Hires pioneered, full-page newspaper ads, brand mascots, collectible trading cards, multi-channel promotional campaigns, celebrity endorsement in the form of the Ladies' Home Journal back page placement, all of these became standard industry practice for every consumer brand that came after. What Charles Hires did in Philadelphia in the 1880s, spending $200,000 in 3 months on advertising alone, would not have looked out of place on Madison Avenue in the 1960s. Even the concept of positioning a beverage as a health product, as something that was good for you, that purified and energized and vitalized, is a framework that Hires pioneered and that every energy drink, health water, and probiotic soda in the modern market traces back to, whether their marketing teams know it or not. And yet the institutions that absorbed Hires root beer, Consolidated Foods, Crush International, Procter & Gamble, Cadbury Schweppes, Dr. Pepper Snapple Group, Keurig Dr. Pepper, understood none of this. They saw a root beer brand with moderate sales figures. They did not see the originator of an American cultural category. They did not see a living museum of American entrepreneurialism. They saw a line item. The competitors that Hires inspired are still thriving. A&W remains the top-selling root beer brand in America, distributed in over 100 countries and supported by a global restaurant chain. Barks, acquired by Coca-Cola in 1995, benefits from the most powerful distribution network in the history of the beverage industry. The student inherited the kingdom. The teacher lost the house. Today, Philadelphia and Tucson and the Internet. On Arch Street in Philadelphia, where the original Charles E. Hires factory once processed tens of thousands of pounds of roots and berries and barks into the drink that built an industry, there is no monument. There is no plaque on the building at 117 to 119 that reads, "Here, America's original soft drink was born." The building has been repurposed and renovated and incorporated into the modern cityscape of old Philadelphia, and if you walk past it without knowing what you are looking at, you will see nothing remarkable at all. On the Delaware River, where the vast plant at Delaware and Fairmount Avenues once operated at industrial scale during the peak Prohibition years, there is nothing left to suggest that this was once the beating heart of a beverage empire that served 65 million glasses of root beer annually from soda fountain counters coast to coast. But the archive exists. The Hagley Library holds the advertising cards and the trade ephemera. The Historical Society of Pennsylvania holds the Hires family papers. Temple University holds newspaper clippings from the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin stretching back to the 1890s. Temple University Press published a scholarly biography, Charles E. Hires and the Drink That Wowed a Nation, by Bill Double, in 2018. The memory is preserved, even if the product is not. Online, a devoted community of root beer enthusiasts keeps Hires root beer alive in conversation. Old bottles surface on eBay and in antique stores, collected as artifacts rather than containers. Vintage advertising cards, those rosy-cheeked children, those cheerful dogs, those full-page Ladies' Home Journal spreads, trade hands among collectors for substantial sums. The physical beauty of the original brand, the sheer visual care that Charles Hires put into every promotional piece, survives him by over a century. And occasionally, someone finds a bottle. A specialty retailer in the American Southwest orders a small case from an obscure distributor. A diner in the Midwest discovers that their fountain supplier still carries Hires syrup. A food journalist writes an obituary for a brand that has not officially died, but seems, in every practical sense, to no longer be living. The responses to these discoveries are always the same: a flood of memory and nostalgia from people who grew up with Hires root beer in their refrigerators and at their soda fountain counters. Stories about drinking it as children with their grandfathers. Stories about root beer floats made with Hires on hot summer afternoons in the 1960s and 1970s. Stories about a taste that cannot quite be replicated and cannot quite be forgotten. That taste was created by a 24-year-old pharmacist from New Jersey on a summer afternoon in 1875 from a recipe he talked a New Jersey farm wife into giving him on his honeymoon. It sustained an empire for nearly a century and a half, and then it was lost. Stand on Arch Street in Philadelphia today and look at the building at 117 to 119. Nothing tells you what happened here. Nothing announces that this is where America fell in love with its first commercially produced soft drink. The city moves around it, indifferent. If you look closely enough, if you know where to search, you might find a glass bottle of Hires root beer on an obscure specialty website, priced with the premium of scarcity. You might find the last entry for Hires on an archived version of the Keurig Dr. Pepper website before it was quietly removed in 2023. You might find those Victorian trading cards in the Hagley Library collection, still crisp and vivid after 130 years. What the story of Hires root beer teaches, first, is the price of founding without defending. Charles Hires built the commercial root beer category, pioneered mass advertising, and created a national brand before any of the institutional structures that protect brands existed. He was generous with his innovations and his market. He showed the industry how to do everything, and the industry learned and then grew larger than he was, and the student eventually devoured the teacher's house. What a founder builds is only as permanent as the people who come after are willing to protect. What the story teaches, second, is the catastrophic effect of serial corporate indifference. Each owner that passed through Hires root beer, Consolidated Foods in 1960, Crush International in 1962, Procter & Gamble in 1980, Cadbury Schweppes in 1989, Dr. Pepper Snapple Group in 2008, Keurig Dr. Pepper in 2018, made rational, short-term decisions that collectively produced an irrational, long-term outcome. Nobody chose to kill Hires root beer. They simply chose, over and over, not to save it. Indifference is not a passive force. It is an active one. What the story teaches, third, is the vulnerability of brands built on identity rather than infrastructure. Hires root beer meant something. It had a story, a founder, a place, a history. But meaning without market power is not a defense. A&W had a restaurant chain. Barks had Coca-Cola's distribution muscle. Hires had a story about a honeymoon in New Jersey and a farm wife's recipe. Stories do not negotiate shelf space contracts. The numbers tell their own quiet tragedy. 147 continuous years of production, from 1876 to approximately 2023. A peak of over 65 million glasses served at soda fountains in a single year. Offices and production in more than 5 countries at the height of the brand's power. Then, discontinued in bottled and canned form in the early 2010s. Removed from the corporate brand listing by 2023. The last syrup producer absorbed in August of 2024. What is left is memory. And memory, however powerful, cannot fill a glass. Somewhere in the vaults of Keurig Dr. Pepper, there is a trademark. There is a formula, modified and reformulated and stripped of its original sassafras soul, but a formula nonetheless. There is a name that once meant something to tens of millions of Americans who pressed their faces against drugstore soda fountain counters and asked for Hires, the greatest health-giving beverage in the world. Charles Elmer Hires was a boy who played with bottles on a New Jersey farm and grew up to give a nation its first taste of something entirely new. His drink outlived him by 86 years. It survived everything the 19th and 20th centuries could throw at it. It could not survive being forgotten by the people who owned it. That is the real story of Hires root beer. Not a tragedy of failure, a tragedy of abandonment.